My daughter sold their house for $500,000 and gave all the money to my son-in-law to invest in his so-called digital business. He set the folder on my kitchen table like it was made of glass. Denise Marlowe, Martin said. That's her real name, not Vanessa Cole. Cole was one of 6 aliases she's used since 2019. I looked at Trent. For the first time since he'd walked into my house with his 6 suitcases and his empty promises, something other than contempt moved across his face. It looked almost like fear. Almost. I don't know who that is, he said. Detective Walsh. I'd catch her full name later. Sarah Walsh. 17 years with the department, the last 9 in financial crimes, didn't even look up from her tablet. You wired her $82,000 4 days ago. Memo line says, consulting fee. We'll get to what kind of consulting. I'd spent 30 years reading numbers the way other people read faces. 28 of those years inside the fraud division of a regional bank, and the last 2 doing contract audits for institutions too embarrassed to admit they'd been robbed by their own vice presidents. I know what a scared liar sounds like. It isn't loud. It's careful. Trent had gone very, very careful. This is insane, Rachel said, but her voice had lost its certainty. 2 hours earlier, she'd been holding my phone hostage to protect her husband. Now she was standing 3 feet from him, like he'd developed a smell. Martin opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of Ohio state court records, a certified name change petition dated 4 years back, and a mugshot that made my stomach fold in on itself. Same jaw, same cold blue eyes, 20 pounds heavier, and a full head of hair he didn't have anymore. But it was him. The name on the petition wasn't Trent Hale. It was Todd Mercer. Bright Path Digital Ventures. Martin read aloud. Collapsed in 2021. 14 investors. $1.2 million. The SEC opened an inquiry. Mr. Mercer relocated before it went anywhere. Rachel made a sound I'd never heard her make before. Something between a laugh and a sob. The kind of sound that comes out when your body understands something before your mind agrees to. You changed your name, she said. Trent, I still can't call him Todd. Even now, even knowing better, because Trent is the name I hate him under. Straightened his shoulders like he was about to sell us something. That was a business failure, not a crime. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody was charged, Detective Walsh said, because your key witness stopped returning calls 3 weeks before the grand jury convened. That's in the file too. I sat down. Not because my legs gave out, though they nearly did, but because I needed both hands flat on my own kitchen table, the one my husband Frank built in 1994, to remind myself this was still my house. That this man had walked into it, eaten at that table, slept in my guest wing, and hit me under my own front door sign, while carrying a second identity in his back pocket like a spare set of keys. Here's what I understood before anyone else in that kitchen did, because I'd built a career on understanding it. Men like Trent don't run one scheme. They run one scheme until it collapses, and then they rebuild the same scheme somewhere new, with a new name and a new set of people who don't know better yet. Rachel didn't know better. Neither did I. Not at first, but I'd spent 3 decades learning to smell it. And once I caught the scent, I couldn't stop pulling threads. That night, after Trent had been walked to a car, not arrested yet, just invited downtown for questioning, which is its own kind of theater, I sat with Rachel at that same table. Her mascara had run in 2 gray lines down her face, and she hadn't noticed or didn't care. How long did you know? She asked me. About Todd Mercer? 10 minutes ago. About the rest of it? I touched the swelling under my eye. Still tender. Already going the color of an overripe plum. Longer. You could have told me. I tried, Rachel. 3 times. You told me I was jealous of your happiness. She flinched like I'd hit her, which felt, I confess, like a small and ugly kind of justice I wasn't proud of wanting. I want to be honest about something because this isn't a story where I get to be a saint. I loved my daughter enough to let her make her own mistakes, and I hated myself for it every single day she was making them. There's a particular kind of helplessness that comes with watching your child hand her whole life to a man you can see straight through, and knowing that if you push too hard, she'll only hold him tighter. So I'd waited, I'd watched, and I'd quietly started keeping files of my own, the way I'd been trained to, long before any suitcases showed up at my door. The next morning, Martin called before I'd finished my coffee. The frozen accounts totaled $294,000. He said. But that's what's left. Priya ran the numbers overnight. Priya Nandakumar had been my colleague for 11 years at the bank, a certified fraud examiner with a mind like a filing cabinet and the patience of a saint. She'd retired the same year I had, and when I called her at 11 p.m. the night before, she hadn't even asked why. She'd just said, "Send me what you have," the way old soldiers answer when the alarm sounds. By 9 that morning, Priya was at my kitchen table with her laptop, 2 mechanical pencils, and a legal pad already half filled with her small, precise handwriting. "This isn't a business, Eleanor," she said, turning her screen toward me. It's a waterfall. Money comes in from new investors, goes straight back out to pay off old ones, skims a management fee at every stage. Classic structure. I've seen it 11 times in 30 years, and it always looks the same on paper. How many investors total? So far, I've traced 11 accounts feeding into his primary LLC. Some are small, $2,000–$3,000. One's your daughter's $500,000. She paused, and I watched her decide whether to soften what she said next and decide against it, because that's who Priya is. One of them is a man named Calvin Ostrowski, retired fire captain. He wired in $110,000 4 months ago. Near as I can tell, that was his entire pension buyout. I knew Calvin. Not well. We'd sat 2 tables apart at a Rotary Club fundraiser 18 months back, but well enough to remember his laugh and the way he'd talked about his grandkids like they hung the moon. How did Trent find him? Priya turned the laptop again. There, in a folder labeled Nexus Capital Client Acquisition, was a flyer. Cream cardstock, tasteful font, the kind of thing that looks legitimate because someone paid a graphic designer instead of spending the money on due diligence. At the bottom, under a photo of Trent in a navy suit he definitely didn't own before he married my daughter, was a line of text that made my hands go cold in a way the morning air hadn't managed. Endorsed by the family of Eleanor Vale, 30-year veteran of institutional risk management. He had used my name, my career, everything I'd spent 3 decades building a reputation on, and he'd printed it on a flyer to convince retired firefighters and widows at the senior center to hand him their life savings. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. I put my hand over my mouth and I sat very still for almost a full minute, because if I'd opened my mouth right then, what came out wouldn't have been useful to anyone. Eleanor, Priya said quietly, there's 2 more like Calvin. A Margaret Alvarez, 71, $40,000, and a couple, the Chens, 62,000 between them, all from that senior center seminar in March. I remembered the seminar. Rachel had mentioned it in passing, proud, the way she'd been proud of everything Trent did that year. He's doing a little talk for some retirees, she'd said. Isn't that sweet? Giving back? Giving back. I laughed out loud at that, alone in my kitchen, and it wasn't a good sound. I called Detective Walsh that afternoon and told her about the flyer. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Mrs. Vale, I need you to understand something, she said. What you're describing, using your name and reputation without consent to solicit investment, that's not just fraud against the people who lost money. Depending on how the DA wants to charge it, that's fraud against you specifically. You may be a victim here in more ways than the ones you already know about. I don't care about being a victim, I said. I care about Calvin Ostrowski getting his pension back. I understand, but you being a named victim means you can't just hand us evidence and walk away. You're going to be part of this case from now until it's over. I need you to be ready for that. I told her I'd been ready for 30 years. She didn't laugh, but I think she almost did. That was the moment the case stopped being something happening to my family and became something I was going to finish personally, with my own 2 hands, whatever it cost. Rachel didn't take it well when I told her about the flyer. I'd hoped, foolishly, that this piece, her mother's name stolen and printed and handed to strangers, might be the thing that finally cracked her all the way open. Instead, she went quiet in a way that frightened me more than her earlier defensiveness had. He wouldn't do that without telling me, she said. Rachel, he forged the loan payoff on your house. He's been living under a different name. He hit your mother in her own doorway. What exactly do you think he wouldn't do? She didn't answer. She went upstairs to the guest wing, my guest wing, in my house, where she and Trent had been sleeping since the night this all started, and she didn't come down for dinner. I understand now, better than I did then, that you cannot argue a person out of a marriage the way you argue a fact out of a spreadsheet. Rachel wasn't stupid. She was grieving a version of her life that hadn't finished dying yet, and grief doesn't move in straight lines. I had to keep reminding myself of that, especially in the 2 weeks that followed, when she seemed to slide backward every time I thought we'd made progress. 2 days after the flyer, an FBI agent named Diane Okafor came to my house. Financial Crimes Division, out of the field office 2 counties over, because Trent's activity, money moving across state lines, victims in at least 2 states once you counted the Ohio collapse, had pushed this past what local police could handle alone. Agent Okafor was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with the kind of stillness that comes from doing a hard job for a long time. She sat at my table. That table had seen more law enforcement in 10 days than it had seen in 30 years, and laid out calmly what federal wire fraud actually meant for a case like this. Every wire transfer that crossed state lines as part of the scheme is a separate count, she said. We're already looking at 9, possibly 11. Add the securities violations from the unregistered investment vehicle, add whatever the state wants to do with the assault and the fraudulent loan document, and Mr. Mercer, Hale, whatever we're calling him this week, is looking at significant exposure. What does significant mean? I asked. I want a number. She almost smiled. You sound like you used to do this job. I did. For longer than you've been alive, probably. Then you know I can't give you a number today. But federal wire fraud alone can carry up to 20 years per count. Nobody serves that realistically, but it gives prosecutors enormous leverage. Leverage. I turned that word over for days afterward. Leverage was what Trent had used on my daughter. Her love for him, her embarrassment, her fear of admitting she'd been wrong, same as he'd used my name and Calvin's pension and Margaret Alvarez's savings. It felt strange and almost holy to hear the same word used as a weapon, pointed the other way for once. The trouble came 4 days later, on a Thursday, when Priya found something in. It felt strange and almost holy to hear the same word used as a weapon, pointed the other way for once. The trouble came 4 days later, on a Thursday, when Priya found something in the account records that none of us had been looking for. He's been moving money, she told me over the phone, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. Small amounts, under the reporting threshold, into a cryptocurrency exchange. Started 2 days after the accounts got frozen. He must have a device we don't know about. Can he get it out of the country? If he converts it to certain coins and moves it to a wallet we can't trace? Possibly. It's not much yet, maybe 40,000, but it's growing every day. And every day it's out. There is a day it might disappear for good. I called Martin. Martin called Agent Okafor. There was a flurry of legal language I mostly understood and partly didn't. Emergency asset freeze, ex parte motion, Judge Patricia Reyes agreeing to hear it on an expedited basis because of the flight risk and the ongoing victim harm. But underneath the legal machinery, there was a more immediate, more human problem, and it landed on my kitchen table 2 hours before the emergency hearing. Rachel came downstairs holding a document. Trent's lawyer sent this over, she said. He wants me to sign it. It transfers the house, his and Trent's condo, from before we sold ours, the one we still technically own together, into a trust. He says it's to protect our assets from the investigation until things get sorted out. I read it twice. It wasn't complicated, not to someone who'd spent a career reading exactly this kind of document. It was a transfer of the one piece of real property left that hadn't been frozen, into an irrevocable trust with a beneficiary designation buried on page 4 that named not Rachel, but a shell entity registered 11 days earlier in Delaware. Rachel, I said, and I made myself say it slowly, because my hands wanted to shake and I needed my voice to stay steady more than I needed anything else in that moment. If you sign this, you're not protecting an asset. You're helping him hide it. And your name goes on the transfer as the person who authorized it. His lawyer said. His lawyer represents him, not you. Do you understand that? Not you. She looked down at the paper in her hands like it had turned into something venomous, which, in a sense, it had. I don't know who to trust anymore, she said. And for the first time since this had all started, she started to cry the way she used to cry as a little girl, not performing it, not weaponizing it, just breaking, quietly, into her own hands. I didn't have a clever line for that. I just held her the way I had when she was 8 and had fallen off her bike and split her chin open, and I let her shake for a while before I said anything else. Don't sign it, I finally said. Call Martin. He'll walk you through getting your own lawyer, someone who works for you and nobody else. Today, not next week. She called Martin from my kitchen. By 4 that afternoon, Judge Reyes had granted the emergency freeze on the condo, and every account Priya had flagged. And Rachel had her own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Beatrice Farrow who specialized, as it happened, in exactly this kind of case, spouses caught in the wreckage of a partner's fraud. Trent was arrested 3 days later, formally, on state charges of assault and forgery, with the federal wire fraud count still moving through a grand jury that Agent Okafor assured me was building something you're going to want to see finished. I thought that would feel like the end. It wasn't even close. The bail hearing was worse than I expected, and I'd expected it to be bad. Trent's defense attorney, a polished man named Russell Koepp, who I later learned specialized in white-collar clients with enough money left to pay a retainer, stood up in front of Judge Alan Osei and made my son-in-law sound like a misunderstood entrepreneur caught in a family squabble. Your Honor, the assault allegation stems from a single, isolated domestic incident during a period of significant financial and emotional stress. My client has no prior criminal record. He is not a flight risk. He has strong ties to the community, a wife, a young family. I sat in the gallery with my jaw so tight it ached, listening to a man describe hitting a 68-year-old woman under her own front door as an isolated incident during a period of stress, as if Trent were the one who'd been wronged by the whole affair. Judge Osei set bail at $75,000, with conditions: surrender of passport, GPS ankle monitor, no contact with me or with any identified investor victims, restricted movement pending trial. $75,000, I said to Martin outside the courtroom, my voice low and furious. He stole $500,000 from my daughter alone. $75,000 is what he pays to walk out that door. I know, Martin said. Bail isn't punishment, Eleanor. It's just supposed to guarantee he shows up. The judge is weighing flight risk against the evidence in front of him today, and frankly, some of what we have hasn't been formally entered yet. It will be, just not yet. I hated that answer. I still do. A little, even now. But I'd worked inside institutions long enough to understand that they move by their own slow, procedural logic, and that logic magic doesn't care how your face still aches when it rains. Trent's mother posted the bond. I hadn't even known she was in the picture until that day. A thin, nervous woman named Carol, who wouldn't meet my eyes in the hallway outside the courtroom. I found out later she'd remortgaged her own condo to cover it. Some mothers protect their children even when their children have stopped deserving it. I understood that better than most people in that hallway, though it didn't make me feel any kindness toward her. Not that day. For 11 days after his release, nothing happened. Trent stayed away, exactly as the order required, and I let myself believe, for the first time since the whole nightmare began, that maybe the worst of it was behind us. I was wrong. I should have known better. I'd built my whole career on knowing better. It was a Tuesday night, 11:52 p.m., when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Rachel, staying 2 floors up in what used to be my guest wing, and had somehow become, in the space of a few weeks, simply her room again. He's outside, front yard. I can see him from the window. My stomach dropped the way it does on the first hill of a roller coaster. All air and no ground. I called 911 with hands that weren't quite steady, gave the dispatcher the address I'd lived at for 41 years, told her there was an active protective order violation in progress. Then I went to the window myself. He was standing on my lawn in the dark, in the exact spot where the porch light doesn't reach, looking up at the house like he was deciding something. I recognized the stillness in him. I'd seen it once before, right before he hit me. It's the stillness of a man who has already decided to do something and is only waiting for the moment to feel right. I didn't go outside. Every instinct in me wanted to march down there and stand between that man and my daughter one more time. But 30 years of reading dangerous people had taught me the difference between courage and recklessness, and I knew which one this called for. I stayed inside, doors locked, and I watched, and I waited, because I understood something Trent didn't. I still had 3 cameras running, and this time, so did the entire street. Video doorbells on both neighboring houses, a dash cam in the Petrosky's Honda Accord parked across the street. The world had gotten smaller and more watched since the last time he'd tried something like this, and he hadn't adjusted for it. He crossed the lawn to the side of the house, to the window of what he must have still thought of as his room. "Rachel," he called up, low but urgent. "Rachel, open the window. I need the laptop, just the laptop, that's all, and I'll go." I understood, standing there in my own hallway at midnight with my heart hammering, exactly what was happening. The FBI raid on Nexus Capital's remaining digital infrastructure was scheduled for the following morning. Agent Okafor had told me as much 3 days earlier, in confidence, because by then I was, in her words, functionally part of the investigative team. Trent must have found out somehow through his lawyer or through Carol or through some channel none of us had closed off yet. And on that laptop, still sitting on the desk in what used to be my guest room, was the full client list. Every name, every dollar amount, every piece of the digital trail that would turn isolated domestic incident into 11 felony counts and counting. If he got that laptop, some of that evidence might disappear before morning. Rachel didn't open the window. I found out later, much later, that she stood frozen behind the curtain for almost a full minute, listening to her husband beg outside in the dark, feeling, she told me, like the last 4 years of her life were a rope being pulled tight enough to cut. "Rachel, please," Trent said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard it crack before. Not for me, not for Calvin Ostrowski, not for anyone he'd ever hurt. "They're going to put me away for 20 years. You're my wife. Help me." She opened the window 3 inches, just enough to speak. "No," she said. I heard it from the hallway, her voice thin but not shaking, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for weeks finally loosened, just slightly, just enough to breathe. Trent's face changed. I watched it happen from the hall window, that same mask slip I'd seen once before under my own front door sign, the charm sliding off like wet paint. "You ungrateful," he started, and then red and blue light washed across the lawn, silent, no sirens, because the responding officers had been briefed on the situation and had cut them a block away. 2 patrol officers took him down without much of a struggle. He wasn't a fighter when the odds weren't in his favor. I'd learned that about him weeks ago, watching him crumble the moment a camera's existence became undeniable. Bail was revoked that night. Violation of a protective order, attempted witness tampering, because a laptop containing evidence in a federal case counts as evidence, and asking your wife to hand it to you counts as tampering. Agent Okafor explained to me the next morning over coffee neither of us drank. This time there was no bond his mother could post to undo it. The FBI raid happened on schedule, 6 hours later, at Nexus Capital's rented office suite. A single room above a dry cleaner, as it turned out, with a glass door lettered in gold vinyl that probably cost more than the actual business inside it. They found the servers. They found the client spreadsheets, the ones Trent had been careless enough to keep in an unencrypted folder, because he'd never expected anyone in his life to be smart enough to catch him. 22 names total, once everything was tallied. 2 states, $2.3 million, across 4 years and 2 identities. The local news ran the story 8 days later, once the DA's office confirmed the arrest and the scope of the charges publicly. I hadn't sought that out. I want to be clear about that, because for a while afterward, people assumed I'd orchestrated the media attention as some kind of revenge, and I hadn't. A reporter named media attention as some kind of revenge, and I hadn't. A reporter named Denise Okafor, no relation to the agent, a coincidence that made both of us laugh grimly when we realized it, had been tracking financial crimes filings for a business desk and noticed the size of the case. She called me directly, and I sat with her for 90 minutes at my kitchen table, that same table, and told her everything I was legally able to tell her. The headline ran, "Fraud Under Two Names, How a Local Digital Investor Bilked Retirees Out of Millions." My name wasn't in the headline. I'd asked for that specifically, and she'd honored it. But once the story ran, 3 more victims came forward within the week, people who'd seen their own losses reflected in the details and finally understood what had actually happened to their money. The final count, by the time the grand jury finished its work, was 26 victims and just over $2.6 million. Calvin Ostrowski called me himself the week the story broke. I hadn't expected that. I'd half imagined he'd hate me somehow for being connected to the man who took his pension, the way people sometimes blame the messenger simply because there's no one else close enough to blame. "Mrs. Vale," he said, his voice gruff in the way I remembered from the Rotary dinner. "I want you to know something. I don't hold what he did against you. That flyer had your name on it, not your hands. You're the reason the FBI ever looked twice at this." I didn't have anything smart to say to that. I just thanked him. And I meant it more than he probably knew. Trent's case never went to trial. Facing 26 victims, a documented history of a prior collapsed scheme under a different legal name, forged property documents, a recorded and now widely corroborated assault, and a witness tampering charge from the night he tried to reclaim that laptop. Russell Kepp negotiated a plea. Trent pled guilty to 11 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of securities fraud, aggravated assault, forgery, and violation of a protective order. Judge Osei, the same judge who'd set that $75,000 bail, and who I'd silently resented for months, sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, with restitution ordered at just under $1.8 million, which everyone in that courtroom understood was a number Trent would likely never fully pay, because men like him rarely leave enough behind to make their victims whole. But the number mattered anyway. It mattered on paper, in a court record that would follow him for the rest of his life, in the way it made his mask slip permanent and public, where once it had only slipped in my hallway, in the dark, for an audience of 1. I sat in the gallery the day of sentencing, 3 rows behind Rachel, who had finally, fully, stopped defending him somewhere around week 6 of the investigation, once she'd read Priya's full accounting of what he'd done and understood. In numbers she couldn't argue her way around. Exactly what her marriage had actually been. She filed for divorce the same month the charges were formalized. Beatrice Farrow handled it for her, pro bono, once she understood the whole picture, which I think surprised Rachel more than almost anything else that happened that year, that a stranger would do something kind for her with nothing to gain. When the judge read the sentence, Trent didn't look at Rachel. He looked at me. I don't know what he expected to see on my face. Triumph, maybe? Cruelty? I gave him neither, because I didn't feel either. Not really. Not by then. Mostly what I felt was tired, and something close to relief. The way you feel when a long fever finally breaks, and your body remembers what it's like to just be still. "You said no one would believe me," I told him, quietly, on my way out of the courtroom, close enough that only he could hear it. 26 people believed me. Try counting that high. He didn't answer. There wasn't anything left in him worth waiting for a response to. Carol, his mother, wrote me a letter about 2 months after the sentencing. I still have it, folded in the same drawer where I keep Frank's old letters, though I'm not entirely sure why I kept it. She apologized, in a halting, guilty way, for the money she'd spent on his bond, for not seeing sooner what her son had become, for the small, ordinary failures of a mother who loves someone too much to look at them clearly. I understand that failure better than most people would guess. I wrote her back exactly 1 line. "We were both fooled by the same man. That doesn't make either of us fools." I don't know if it helped her. I hope it did. Rachel moved back into my house that spring. Not into the guest wing this time, but into her old childhood bedroom, the one with the yellow curtains she'd picked out herself at 14, and that I'd never gotten around to replacing. It took her the better part of a year to stop apologizing to me every single day for something new. For the money, for not believing me sooner, for the bruise under my eye that had long since healed but that she still flinched away from whenever she caught sight of the old photos from that week. I told her, more times than I can count, that I didn't need the apologies. What I needed was for her to trust her own judgment again, slowly, the way you retrain a muscle after an injury. She started 6 months after the sentencing, working 2 days a week at a local credit union's fraud prevention desk, entry level, answering phones mostly, flagging suspicious transactions for someone else to review. It wasn't glamorous. But I watched my daughter, who had once laughed at me for asking Trent a simple question about what his business actually did, sit at her own desk and ask exactly those kinds of questions to strangers on the phone, patiently, carefully, the way I'd been trained to ask them 30 years before she was even born. I still keep those 3 cameras running, the smoke detector, the doorbell, Frank's old clock. Old habits, I suppose. Or maybe just the honest understanding that some lessons are worth carrying for the rest of your life, even after the danger that taught them to you is sitting in a federal facility 400 miles away, unlikely to trouble either of us again for a very long time. Calvin Ostrowski got back about 60% of his pension over the following 2 years, through the restitution order and a civil settlement Martin helped him pursue. Margaret Alvarez recovered less. The Chens, less still. Justice, I've learned, doesn't come back in the same shape it left in. It comes back partial, and late, and imperfect, and you take it anyway, because the alternative is nothing at all. Rachel asked me once, not long ago, sitting at that same kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, whether I regretted letting them stay that first night, letting him sleep under my roof one more time, knowing what I already half suspected about him. I thought about it for a long moment before I answered. No, I said. That was the night I got everything I needed. He thought staying meant he'd won. He didn't understand that in my house the walls have always been listening. She almost smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from her in longer than I wanted to admit. He took my daughter's life savings, my name, and my sense of safety under my own roof, and for a little while he took my daughter's trust in me too, which hurt worse than the bruise ever did. But he never once, in all his careful, calculated cruelty, understood what he was actually dealing with. A woman who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how men like him think, and who had nothing left to lose by outlasting him. In the end, he lost the name he stole to escape his first collapse and the one he built to disguise his second. He lost his freedom, his mother's condo, whatever was left of his mother's trust in him, and every dollar he hadn't already burned. He'll leave prison eventually, an old man with no name anyone will extend credit to ever again. I got my daughter back. That was always the only account that mattered to me.